September 8, 1941. The vast advance of Hitler's army group north reached the shores of Lake Ladoga, completing the encirclement of Leningrad, the former capital of the Russian Empire and the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution. This act began the longest and most devastating siege of a major city in human history. A siege of 872 days that was fueled by Hitler's dark, genocidal command decision to eradicate the city and its population completely. Compelling evidence, Hitler's Führer Directive No. 35 explicitly ordered that Leningrad was not to be taken by storm, but was to be sealed off and starved into submission. This was a deliberate act of mass murder by starvation, designed to remove the city and its population from the map and free up German troops for the drive on Moscow. This order created an immediate, fatal strategic flaw for the German army. Instead of using the decisive power of their panzers to end the siege quickly, they were diverted to Moscow, leaving the city in a perpetual state of isolation rather than total defeat. Insightful expert, quote, German commanders noted the order with chilling clarity, realizing the immense military manpower that would be tied up for years maintaining the encirclement. Hitler's ideological goal superseded military logic, ensuring a long, costly stalemate. Vivid example. Within weeks, the German advance had cut the city's vital railway lines, water intake points, and, most critically, its fuel and food supply. The final link to the outside world, Lake Ladoga, was already under German artillery observation, turning the massive city into a sealed-off, starving prison. The rich explanation for Hitler's refusal to capture the city lies in his ideological fanaticism. He wanted to prevent any future use of the city's intellectual or industrial resources, preferring its total destruction over occupation, guaranteeing an absolute war of annihilation against the civilian populace. Ideology supersedes strategy. A military action driven by ideological hatred rather than tactical gain commits vast resources to a prolonged, costly siege. Hitler's command decision turned Leningrad into a massive, starving kessel. The German siege lines were maintained by a relentless artillery barrage and a vast, systematic interdiction of any incoming supplies, creating a terrifying statistical reality of civilian life under siege. Compelling evidence. The German siege artillery maintained a constant 2-year barrage on the city, firing hundreds of thousands of shells into the streets and homes. The city's immense industrial capacity, including the famed Kirov works, was constantly targeted, though workers continued to produce tanks and guns under fire. The true, staggering cost was paid by the civilian population through starvation. Food rations plummeted to levels barely capable of sustaining life. By November 1941, the average worker received only 250 grams of bread per day, with non-workers receiving just 125 grams, less than half a pound for 2 days of life. Insightful expert, quote, Historians estimate that the caloric intake for a non-working citizen fell to barely 500 calories per day, a starvation diet that guaranteed mass mortality. The suffering was not accidental. It was the direct, calculated result of the German encirclement strategy. Vivid example. The immense cold of the first winter, with temperatures dropping to 30 degrees Celsius, compounded the starvation. Heating fuel vanished, electricity was rationed, and water pipes froze and burst. Citizens were forced to burn furniture and books for scant warmth, fighting an impossible dual battle against the enemy and the climate. The rich explanation for this rapid collapse of order in life is that the German encirclement was strategically positioned to cut off all major supply routes simultaneously, leaving the city dependent on a single precarious source of resupply. Lake Ladoga, a vulnerability the Germans exploited. With relentless air and artillery fire, starvation as a weapon. A deliberate strategy to cut all food and fuel supplies transforms a military siege into a calculated act of mass murder. The German siege guaranteed mass civilian mortality as a strategic objective. The salvation of the trapped population hinged on the single, most precarious logistical feat of the entire war, the road of life. Across frozen Lake Ladoga, a desperate, high-stakes supply line that was continuously exposed to German fire. Compelling evidence. During the long, brutal winter months, the Soviet command risked hundreds of trucks and thousands of personnel to transport supplies across the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga, often under cover of night, fighting the constant threat of German artillery and Luftwaffe attacks. The ice was a deceptive and deadly enemy. Trucks often broke through the ice, plunging their cargo of food and their drivers into the sub-zero water. The mortality rate for drivers was catastrophic, underscoring the extreme personal danger of every single supply run. Insightful expert, Soviet accounts described the psychological pressure as unrelenting. The truck drivers, often young men and women, were driving on a road marked only by thin branches, knowing the enemy was constantly sighting in on their convoys and that the ice itself could give way at any moment. Vivid example, the road of life was not just a supply route, it was an evacuation route. Hundreds of thousands of children, the elderly and the sick, were transported out of the starving city on the return journeys, often arriving at the safety of the eastern shore suffering from extreme exposure and malnutrition. The rich explanation for the success of the road of life is that it was a triumph of human tenacity and logistical ingenuity over both the environment and the enemy. Though slow and incredibly costly in human life, it provided the minimal caloric intake necessary to prevent the city's total collapse, thwarting Hitler's command decision. Tenacity defeats attrition. A single, continuous logistical lifeline, maintained despite overwhelming enemy fire and environmental extremes, is the ultimate counter to a siege strategy. The road of life was the narrow passage between annihilation and survival. The true, ultimate cost of the siege was the staggering loss of civilian life, a statistical reality that ranks among the worst atrocities of the entire war. Compelling evidence. During the first winter alone, 1941-1942, approximately 700,000 citizens died from starvation, disease, and cold. By the siege's end, the total death toll exceeded 1 million civilians, vastly surpassing the death toll of many major military campaigns. The statistics of the mortality rate are chilling. In the worst months, daily death rates peaked at over 4,000 people, with bodies often frozen in the streets, unable to be collected due to the lack of fuel and manpower, creating a constant grim spectacle. Insightful expert, quote, "The human cost represented a deliberate, calculated act of mass murder, confirming the genocidal intent behind Hitler's command decision to starve the city. The siege was a direct attack on a civilian population to achieve strategic demoralization and elimination." Text vivid example. The infamous blockade siege bread became the grim symbol of survival. A small, dark, heavy ration that often contained cellulose and sawdust filler, a tragic testament to the city's desperation and ingenuity in maintaining a semblance of life. The rich explanation for this overwhelming death toll is that the siege was total and absolute. Unlike other encircled cities, Leningrad received virtually no relief for 2 years, forcing its citizens to endure conditions of calculated, prolonged, and extreme deprivation that guaranteed mass mortality. The siege's true cost. The ultimate measure of a siege's brutality is its calculated civilian death toll. Leningrad's million dead civilians remain the eternal indictment of the German encirclement strategy. The strategic dynamics of the Eastern Front finally began to turn against the German besiegers in 1943, creating a crucial, surprising insight. The Red Army, having learned the painful lessons of the early war, developed the operational capacity necessary to coordinate the massive effort required to breach the German lines and partially relieve the city. Compelling evidence. The first successful breach of the blockade came in January 1943 with Operation Iskra Spark. The Soviet forces, utilizing artillery from the mainland and ground troops from within the city, successfully punched a small, narrow corridor through the German defenses near the shores of Lake Ladoga. This breakthrough was a direct testament to the Soviet victory at Stalingrad and the resurgence of the Red Army's operational capacity. It proved that the Wehrmacht could no longer maintain its rigid, static encirclement under concentrated Soviet pressure. Insightful expert, quote, "The corridor was barely 10 kilometers wide, but its existence was an immense strategic and psychological victory. Within weeks, the Soviets built a provisional railway line across this narrow gap, providing a more reliable and secure supply route than the vulnerable road of life." Vivid example. The opening of this railway link, though immediately subjected to relentless German artillery fire, allowed a massive increase in the flow of food and fuel, permanently raising the city's caloric intake and signaling the end of the worst period of starvation and mass mortality. The rich explanation for the strategic importance of this breach is that it fundamentally destabilized the German siege line. It transformed the German position from a total blockade into a vulnerable, semi-permeable line that now required constant, costly attention to prevent further Soviet breakthroughs. Breaching the seal. A military breach of a total encirclement line shatters the enemy's psychological and strategic advantage. Operation Iskra proved the resilience and resurgence of the Red Army's offensive capacity. The final, total lifting of the siege was achieved a year later, confirming the full strategic reversal on the Eastern Front, a statistical reality that sealed the fate of Army Group North. Compelling evidence. The decisive operation, Operation Leningrad, Novgorod, began in January 1944. Soviet forces launched a powerful, coordinated offensive that drove the German siege forces back, systematically dismantling the entire German position around the city. This offensive utilized the full might of the resurgent Red Army, leveraging massive reserves of artillery and armor to achieve a large strategic penetration, forcing the entire German Army Group North into a prolonged, costly, and irreversible retreat. Insightful expert, quote, "The successful completion of the offensive resulted in the siege being lifted on January 27, 1944, a day now commemorated as a symbol of Russian endurance. The German army was pushed back between 100 to 280 kilometers, definitively ending the threat to the city." Vivid example. The final lifting of the siege exposed the utter collapse of the German siege infrastructure. Hundreds of German guns and tons of equipment were captured or abandoned, confirming the logistical and strategic failure of Hitler's long-term encirclement policy. The rich explanation for the strategic finality is that the defeat forced the entire German Army Group North into a desperate retreat towards the Baltic states, freeing up massive Soviet forces for the subsequent summer offensives and guaranteeing the strategic collapse of the entire northern sector of the Eastern Front. Annihilation of the besiegers. The final defeat of a siege is achieved when the besieging forces are themselves routed and driven away. The total lifting of the Leningrad siege was a strategic victory with irreversible consequences for the German war effort. The survival of Leningrad was entirely dependent on winning the logistical war across the ice of Lake Ladoga, creating a chilling, vivid scenario of courage, logistics, and continuous danger. This desperate supply effort, the road of life, required a level of human tenacity and engineering ingenuity rarely matched in modern warfare. Compelling evidence. The logistical operation involved hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies and the evacuation of roughly 500,000 citizens across the frozen lake. The trucks had to maintain precise speed and spacing to prevent the ice from cracking under the rhythmic pressure, a task made treacherous by the German air and artillery spotting. The mortality rate for the truck drivers, often young and poorly trained, was catastrophic. Trucks were frequently lost when German artillery hit the ice, or when the surface simply gave way due to cracks, plunging drivers and vital cargo into the sub-zero water, a grim statistical reality of the supply effort. Insightful expert quote, "The Soviet command prioritized the opening of the railway line across the ice, a staggering feat of wartime engineering. Once complete, it allowed the transfer of large, vital cargo like heavy machinery and oil, ensuring the city's continued industrial output despite the siege." Vivid example. Even during the summer months, the logistics war continued. Barges carrying food and fuel were brought across the lake, only to be relentlessly targeted by the Luftwaffe and German surface vessels, forcing the Soviet Navy to fight continuous, desperate engagements to protect the supply lines. The rich explanation for the ultimate success of the road of life is that it was not a single tactic, but a continuous, adaptable logistics system that maximized all available resources, ice road, barges, and eventually the provisional railway to circumvent Hitler's annihilation order. Adaptability defeats siege. A single, continuous logistical lifeline, maintained despite overwhelming enemy fire and environmental extremes, is the ultimate counter to a siege strategy. The road of life was the narrow passage between annihilation and survival. The internal management of the city's remaining resources, driven by the command decision to prioritize military production over civilian consumption, led to extreme internal pressures and ethical crises. Compelling evidence. The Soviet authorities maintained a strict, tiered rationing system that deliberately favored workers in the Kirov works and other military factories over non-working civilians, including artists, children, and the elderly. This ruthless utilitarian system was a direct, pragmatic command decision to ensure the city continued to produce tanks like the KV-1 and artillery, despite the mass starvation, proving that military necessity transcended all humanitarian concerns. Insightful expert quote, "While the population suffered and died in staggering numbers, the city's key industries never ceased production. The city built over 2,000 tanks and 1,500 aircraft during the siege, a testament to the grim efficiency of the priority rationing system." Vivid example. The infamous 25-gram bread rations for non-workers became the grim symbol of survival, leading to widespread cannibalism and the collapse of civil order in the most desperate months, a tragic reflection of the ethical extremes imposed by starvation. The rich explanation for the city's endurance is that the Soviet leadership successfully mobilized a fierce, ideologically driven resistance. The citizens understood that surrender meant mass execution by the Germans, fueling a grim determination to survive at any cost and defeat Hitler's genocidal objective. Necessity overrides humanity. A siege compels ruthless utilitarian choices where military production is prioritized over civilian survival. The endurance of Leningrad was purchased at the staggering price of its own population. The Siege of Leningrad was also a war against science and culture, creating a unique and often overlooked unseen scars on the city's identity and its future. Compelling evidence. Despite the massive statistical reality of mass death and starvation, the city's scientific and cultural institutions continued to function. Scientists and researchers bravely worked to find alternative food sources, such as using industrial materials, and maintain the city's infrastructure. The staff of the famed Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry made a profound, silent sacrifice. They guarded one of the world's largest seed banks, containing thousands of irreplaceable samples. They starved to death in their offices, refusing to eat the valuable seeds, thus preserving a crucial piece of global agricultural heritage. Insightful expert quote, "The continuation of the city's cultural life, including concerts by the composer Dmitri Shostakovich, whose famed Seventh Symphony was premiered in the starving city, served as a powerful propaganda tool, bolstering the population's morale and affirming their defiance to the outside world." Vivid example. Engineers and specialists worked tirelessly to adapt the city's tram system to transport food, medical supplies, and, gruesomely, the dead, illustrating the grim ingenuity required to maintain a functional city under conditions of absolute deprivation. The rich explanation for this defiance is that Leningrad, as the revolutionary capital and intellectual heart of Russia, was fighting an existential war for its culture and history. The commitment to preserve its heritage was seen as an act of resistance against the Nazis' dehumanizing objective. Culture as defiance. The preservation of intellectual and cultural life under siege becomes an act of powerful political and psychological resistance. Leningrad preserved its historical soul against Hitler's attempt at erasure. The final victory over the German besiegers was a combined achievement of military might and psychological warfare, creating a decisive strategic finality for the entire Northern Front. Compelling evidence. The Soviet forces, utilizing the vast reserves of artillery and armor freed up after the decisive victory at Kursk, launched the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive in January 1944. This attack involved an unprecedented concentration of force to shatter the German lines. The systematic rout of Sukhumi Group North pushed the Germans back hundreds of kilometers, securing the entire Baltic coast and freeing up massive Soviet armies for the subsequent summer offensives that would threaten the German heartland. Insightful expert quote, "The defeat was a direct, fatal consequence of Hitler's earlier command decision to tie up vast German resources in a static siege. When the Soviet army finally struck with its full might, the under-resourced German perimeter crumbled instantly." Vivid example. The final German positions were completely dismantled, resulting in the capture or destruction of hundreds of German artillery pieces that had rained terror on the city for 2.5 years. The destruction of this infrastructure was complete and irreversible. The rich explanation for the strategic finality is that the total lifting of the siege transformed the entire geopolitical landscape of the Eastern Front, freeing up vast Soviet manpower and securing the Baltic Sea flank for the final advance towards Germany. Finality is strategic. The military victory that lifts a siege secures a massive, irreversible shift in the strategic balance of the entire theater. The defeat of Army Group North guaranteed the final territorial integrity of the Soviet Union. The Siege of Leningrad left a geopolitical legacy of suffering and defiance, serving as a permanent indictment of the brutality of Nazi ideological warfare and the relentless statistical reality of civilian sacrifice. Compelling evidence. The total death toll of approximately 1 million civilians remains the single most devastating civilian loss in any major city during World War II, a calculated act of mass murder that was rarely matched in scale. The survival of the city, driven by the fierce endurance of its people and the tenacity of the logistics teams, became a permanent pillar of Soviet state propaganda, used to affirm the ideological superiority and resilience of the Soviet system over the Nazi aggression. Insightful expert quote, "The siege is often cited by historians not just as a military event, but as a moral indictment of Hitler's ideology. The suffering was not a byproduct of warfare. It was the direct, calculated goal of the Nazi high command. Vivid example: the Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, contains the mass graves of nearly 500,000 siege victims, serving as the physical monument to the staggering human cost and the statistical reality of the German encirclement strategy. The rich explanation for the battle's grim legacy is that it fundamentally shaped the post-war Soviet narrative of victimhood and victory, cementing the population's willingness to endure extreme sacrifices and justifying the subsequent severity of the Soviet push into Germany. Sacrifice shapes memory. A prolonged, total siege that inflicts catastrophic civilian losses becomes a central, defining narrative of national survival and justifies future acts of retaliation. Leningrad's suffering fueled the final, vengeful drive toward Berlin. The enduring lesson of Leningrad for modern warfare is the vulnerability of major urban centers to total siege and the power of ideological resistance, creating a final, somber thought. Provoking advice point. Compelling evidence. The siege demonstrated the limits of even the most brutal military force when faced with a population committed to total resistance and an enemy, the Soviet logistics teams, willing to endure unsustainable losses to maintain a vital lifeline. Leningrad stands as a permanent warning about the strategic futility of committing massive resources to a non-decisive siege, proving that the ideological fervor required to endure can overcome the tactical superiority required to defeat. Insightful expert, quote, "Military strategists study the siege today for its lessons in urban resilience, resource allocation under duress, and the devastating impact of starvation as a weapon of war. A grim, eternal blueprint of total annihilation." Vivid example: the sheer commitment of the city's population to survive and continue military production demonstrates the power of a unified resistance that transforms a civilian population into an active, strategic component of the defense against the invader. The rich explanation for the battle's timeless legacy is that it affirmed that the ultimate outcome of the siege is often determined by the morale, endurance, and logistical resilience of the defender, not simply the firepower of the besieger. Leningrad was a victory of human will over calculated brutality, endurance over force. The ultimate measure of a siege's success is the defender's will to survive and maintain strategic function. The resilience of Leningrad proved that ideology cannot annihilate human will. The Soviet victory that lifted the siege in January 1944 was not just a local success. It was a systematic offensive that guaranteed the military collapse of the entire northern sector of the Eastern Front, creating a definitive strategic finality. Compelling evidence. The Leningrad-Novgorod offensive was a massive undertaking involving two powerful Soviet fronts and was launched simultaneously against the German 18th and 60th armies. The Soviet goal was not merely to breach the line, but to trap and annihilate the German forces. The primary breakthrough utilized the massive concentration of artillery freed up from the successful anti-siege operations, achieving penetrations that quickly bypassed the rigid German strongpoints, forcing the entire German Army Group North into a desperate, continuous retreat. Insightful expert, quote, "German commanders were forced into a prolonged retreat across the Baltic states, often referred to as the Narva Retreat and the Courland Pocket Battles. This was an irreversible military consequence that eliminated the German strategic presence in the Baltic region." Vivid example: the final German resistance was forced into the 6th Courland Pocket in Latvia, where over 200,000 German troops were surrounded and remained cut off until the end of the war, a direct, fatal consequence of the siege being lifted and the subsequent Soviet strategic momentum. The rich explanation for this total collapse is that Hitler's command decision to tie up these troops for years meant they lacked the mobility, fuel, and reserves to conduct a successful, fluid defense when finally confronted by the full might of the resurgent Red Army. Stalemate creates vulnerability. A prolonged, static siege ultimately ties down resources that are annihilated when the strategic initiative shifts. The lifting of the siege guaranteed the military fate of the entire German Army Group North. The military defeat exposed the critical failure of the German defense to adapt to the brutal statistical reality of the Soviet buildup, providing a final indictment of the Nazi regime's command structure. Compelling evidence. The German forces had maintained the siege using primarily static infantry and heavy siege artillery, failing to anticipate or prepare for the massive, coordinated mechanized counteroffensive the Soviets had developed since 1941. German losses in the final offensive were severe, estimated at over 100,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured, and thousands of pieces of irreplaceable equipment, depleting Hitler's reserve of manpower that was desperately needed on the crumbling central and southern fronts. Insightful expert, quote, "Post-war analysis confirmed that the German High Command consistently underestimated the operational capability and logistical resilience of the Red Army, leading to repeated strategic surprises and subsequent tactical collapses." Vivid example: the capture of the German heavy siege artillery pieces, including the immense Dora gun each end and Karl Garat mortars, which had tormented the city for years, provided the Soviets with a powerful propaganda victory and removed a major physical threat to the Baltic region. The rich explanation for the high casualties is that the German troops were psychologically and physically exhausted from years of static siege duty and were ill-prepared for the shock of a massive, mobile offensive, leading to widespread demoralization and large-scale surrenders. Exhaustion precedes collapse. An army maintained on static siege duty is qualitatively unprepared for a massive, fluid mechanized counteroffensive. The German army was exhausted and brittle when the Soviets finally struck. The endurance of Leningrad was founded on the city's heroic, grim industrial defiance, creating an often overlooked, surprising insight. Despite the mass starvation and continuous shelling, Leningrad's factories became a crucial symbol of Soviet resilience, maintaining the production of vital military hardware. Compelling evidence: the Kirov Works, the massive tank and heavy machinery factory, never ceased production, even in the worst months of the siege. Workers, starving and often collapsing from exhaustion, continued to assemble and repair KB-1 heavy tanks and artillery pieces. This continuous industrial output was a deliberate command decision by Soviet authorities to ensure the city remained a functional military asset, even at the cost of massive civilian mortality due to the prioritization of rations for factory workers. Insightful expert, quote, "Workers often had to be transported to the factory floor using sleds because they were too weak to walk, a chilling testament to the extreme conditions under which production was maintained. The output was a direct act of ideological and physical defiance." Vivid example: the workers, powered by the meager 250-gramus bread ration, repaired and maintained thousands of Soviet armored vehicles, ensuring the armies fighting nearby were kept supplied and operational, underscoring the city's strategic military value. The rich explanation for this defiance is that the factories became symbolic battlegrounds. The Soviet government successfully leveraged the siege to portray the workers as heroes, bolstering morale and providing a powerful, ideological justification for enduring the extreme sacrifices imposed by the German encirclement. Industry sustains resistance. The continued functioning of military industry under total siege provides a critical moral and material lifeline. The Kirov Works became the beating heart of Leningrad's resistance. The city's survival also hinged on the preservation of its scientific and intellectual capital, creating a profound, unsung, unseen scars on the nation's heritage. Compelling evidence: the courageous actions of the scientists at the Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry, who starved to death while guarding one of the world's most valuable seed banks, refusing to eat the priceless samples, stands as the single most profound act of intellectual sacrifice. This act of preservation secured a vital genetic database for future global agriculture, demonstrating a commitment to human heritage and science that defied the immediate, brutal military reality of the siege. Insightful expert, quote, "The continuation of high culture, including the famous performance of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in August 1942, broadcast over loudspeakers to German lines, served as a powerful act of psychological resistance, affirming the city's intellectual vitality against the Nazi goal of complete erasure." Vivid example: the immense cold forced the citizens to burn books, furniture, and any available wood for heat, leading to irreplaceable losses of historical documents and cultural artifacts, a grim consequence of the German strategy of starvation and environmental warfare. The rich explanation for this cultural defiance is that the people of Leningrad understood their city represented the historical and intellectual soul of the nation. Their struggle became an existential defense of Russian identity against the barbaric goals of the Third Reich. Culture defies annihilation. The preservation of intellectual and cultural life under siege becomes an act of powerful political and psychological resistance. Leningrad preserved its historical soul against Hitler's attempt at erasure. The Siege of Leningrad left a deep, irreversible geopolitical legacy that fueled Soviet foreign policy and justified the final, brutal push into Germany, serving as a permanent indictment of the ideological war. Compelling evidence. The immense civilian death toll, over 1 million people, became the cornerstone of the post-war Soviet narrative of victory and victimhood, cementing the population's willingness to endure extreme sacrifices and justifying the subsequent severity of the Red Army's advance. This immense suffering affirmed the Soviet state's moral authority in demanding absolute security from its western borders, directly influencing post-war political and territorial negotiations in Eastern Europe, and solidifying the Soviet position in the emerging Cold War. Insightful expert, quote, "The siege is often cited by Western historians not just as a military event, but as a moral indictment of Hitler's ideology. The suffering was not a byproduct of warfare. It was the direct, calculated goal of the Nazi high command, using starvation as a deliberate tool of mass murder." Vivid example. The Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery remains the physical monument to the staggering statistical reality of the siege, hosting the mass graves of nearly 500,000 victims, a silent, eternal reminder of the human cost that fueled Soviet strategic resolve. The rich explanation for this geopolitical hardening is that the siege fostered a national trauma that demanded absolute retribution, making the subsequent severity of the Soviet advance across German territory an inevitable consequence of the barbaric tactics employed at Leningrad. Trauma fuels resolve. A prolonged, total siege that inflicts catastrophic civilian losses becomes a central, defining narrative of national survival and justifies future acts of retaliation. Leningrad's suffering fueled the final, vengeful drive toward Berlin. The enduring lesson of Leningrad for modern strategic analysis is the vulnerability of major urban centers to total siege, and the final, enduring truths about the limits of military force, creating a final, somber thought. Provoking advice point. Compelling evidence. The siege proved the limits of even the most brutal military force when faced with a defender committed to total resistance and a logistical structure willing to endure unsustainable losses to maintain a vital lifeline. The eventual failure of the siege proved that ideological fanaticism Hitler's could not overcome the material reality of a nation, the Soviet Union, committed to total industrial mobilization and absolute psychological defense. Insightful expert, quote, "Military strategists study the siege today for its lessons in urban resilience, resource allocation under duress, and the devastating impact of starvation as a weapon of war, a grim, eternal blueprint of total annihilation." Vivid example. The ultimate defeat of the besieging forces confirmed that the outcome of a siege is often determined by the morale, endurance, and logistical ingenuity of the defender, not simply the firepower of the besieger. The human spirit became the ultimate strategic asset. The rich explanation for the battle's timeless legacy is that it affirmed that the resilience of a population is the ultimate strategic resource. Leningrad was a victory of human will over calculated brutality, ensuring the city's story serves as a permanent, powerful warning for generations to come. Endurance over force. The ultimate measure of a siege's success is the defender's will to survive and maintain strategic function. The resilience of Leningrad proved that ideology cannot annihilate human will. The defense of Leningrad was not just a ground and air battle. It was a desperate naval engagement where the Soviet Baltic Fleet, trapped in the city's harbor, played a crucial static role, creating a unique, vivid scenario of siege warfare. Compelling evidence. After being largely neutralized by German land advances, the surviving ships of the Baltic Fleet, including the battleships Murat and October Revolution, were used as massive, immobile floating artillery batteries. These heavy guns, manned by naval personnel, provided crucial long-range fire support for the Soviet defense lines, targeting German assembly points and artillery positions on the distant siege perimeter, proving invaluable during the crucial breakthrough attempts. Insightful expert, quote, "German commanders repeatedly noted the frustrating effectiveness of the Soviet naval guns, which, being heavily armored and positioned deep within the city's defenses, were difficult to silence, forcing the Wehrmacht to commit disproportionate resources to counter battery." Or, vivid example. The immense battleships often fired over open sights or were guided by forward observers inside the city, their massive shells disrupting German operations and providing a critical moral boost to the starving defenders who could hear the deep rumble of their own navy fighting back. The rich explanation for the fleet's static role is that the ships were trapped by the German capture of surrounding ports and the laying of mines in the shallow waters, transforming them from offensive assets into a last, formidable piece of siege defense infrastructure. Static firepower sustains defense. The neutralization of a large naval fleet by land forces does not eliminate its value. The immobilized Baltic fleet became a critical, long-range component of Leningrad's defense. The fight for the supply lines included continuous, desperate actions by Soviet naval forces on Lake Ladoga, creating a relentless statistical reality of daily loss and heroism. Compelling evidence. The Ladoga flotilla, a collection of small gunboats, barges, and icebreakers, fought a continuous 2-year battle against the German and Finnish navies and the relentless Luftwaffe to protect the road of life. The flotilla's primary task was anti-aircraft defense for the supply convoys and the establishment of safe shipping lanes. They fought hundreds of minor engagements, suffering devastating losses in men and materiel, but ensuring the continuous flow of food and supplies. Insightful expert, quote, "The logistical importance of the flotilla was paramount. Every ton of food they protected meant dozens of lives saved inside the city. Their struggle affirmed that the fight for survival was paid for in daily, unsung sacrifice on the treacherous lake waters." Vivid example. During the thawing months, German artillery units relentlessly targeted the supply barges, forcing the naval personnel to engage in continuous, high-risk salvage operations to recover sunken cargo before it was lost forever to the depths of the lake. The rich explanation for the high cost is that the Germans focused on asymmetric warfare, using dive bombers and fast torpedo boats to destroy the slow, vulnerable supply barges, forcing the Soviet Navy into a costly war of attrition where every successful convoy was a hard-won victory. Control of the logistics route. A naval force committed to the defense of a critical, exposed supply line is the ultimate counter to a siege's starvation strategy. The Ladoga flotilla was the shield of the road of life. The German command, frustrated by the resilience of the city and the heavy commitment of manpower, launched several intense but ultimately futile ground offensives to breach the defenses, confirming the strength of the ideological resistance. Compelling evidence. The Wehrmacht launched major offensives, such as Operation Nordlicht Northern Light, designed to finally overwhelm the city's defenses and end the siege. These operations involved substantial concentrations of armor and infantry. However, these attacks were consistently repulsed by the fierce, coordinated defense of the Soviet Leningrad front, which utilized the city's dense urban and industrial landscape to neutralize German advantages in maneuverability and armor. Insightful expert. Quote, "German field reports frequently noted the unexpected ferocity and tenacity of the Soviet defense, often manned by militia and factory workers who understood that capture meant execution. This ideological resistance proved far harder to break than conventional military lines." Vivid example. The German attempts to capture the key industrial districts, such as the areas around the Sekirov works, dissolved into brutal, costly house-to-house combat, where every factory building was turned into an impenetrable fortress, consuming German manpower at a terrifying rate. The rich explanation for the German failure to take the city is that they were defeated by a combination of strong Soviet defensive layering and the ideological fanaticism of the defenders, proving that the will to survive can overcome technological superiority in urban warfare. Urban resistance is costly. A defense that leverages ideological fanaticism and dense urban terrain can neutralize the invaders' advantages in maneuver and armor. Leningrad's city workers proved the strategic strength of absolute resistance. The Soviet final victory at Leningrad was fundamentally secured by their mastery of combined arms in the counteroffensive, a tactical shift that sealed the fate of Army Group North. Compelling evidence. The Leningrad-Novgorod offensive was a flawless execution of combined arms doctrine, featuring simultaneous attacks across multiple axes, devastating artillery preparation, and the rapid exploitation by tank units. The strategic goal was to prevent the German forces from withdrawing in an orderly fashion, forcing them into a catastrophic rout and ensuring the maximum statistical loss of men and equipment as they fled towards the Baltic states. Insightful expert quote. The ultimate Soviet success was rooted in their logistical maturity. Unlike the Germans, who stalled due to lack of fuel, the Soviet follow-up forces were able to maintain relentless pressure thanks to reliable Lend-Lease transport and a streamlined supply chain. Vivid example. The final rout of the German forces was so disorganized that entire batteries of heavy siege artillery were abandoned intact, a visible testament to the strategic failure of the German command to plan for anything other than a long, static siege, illustrating the irreversible loss of their military assets. The rich explanation for the strategic finality is that the defeat was absolute. The German Army Group North was permanently removed as a viable threat to the Soviet Union, freeing up massive resources for the subsequent campaigns aimed directly at the German heartland. Systematic force guarantees rout. A combined arms offensive designed for deep penetration and mass destruction ensures the annihilation of a static defensive force. The routing of Army Group North secured the northern flank for the final drive on Berlin. The Siege of Leningrad stands as a permanent, moral indictment of ideological warfare and the definitive example of extreme civilian sacrifice, creating a final, somber thought, provoking advice point, compelling evidence. The total human cost of 1 million civilian deaths remains the ultimate statistical reality of the German encirclement policy, confirming the genocidal intent behind Hitler's command decision to use starvation as a weapon of mass annihilation. The strategic decision to maintain the siege for 872 days, consuming vast German military resources, proved to be a major strategic blunder that ultimately committed more resources to a non-decisive front than any other single military mistake in the East. Insightful expert quote, "The battle is studied today for its lessons in urban resilience and resource allocation under duress. It proved that a population united by fierce ideological defense and capable of logistical ingenuity can withstand even the most absolute military pressure." Vivid example: the C.S. Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery, hosting the mass graves of nearly 500,000 victims, serves as the physical, eternal monument to the civilian death toll, a stark contrast to the small number of German military casualties inflicted by the siege itself. The rich explanation for the moral legacy is that the siege fostered a national trauma in the Soviet Union that demanded and justified absolute retribution, fueling the final, unforgiving push across Eastern Europe and into Germany. Moral cost fuels war. A siege that inflicts catastrophic civilian losses becomes a central, defining narrative of national survival and justifies future acts of retaliation. Leningrad's suffering fueled the final, vengeful drive toward Berlin. The enduring legacy of the Leningrad siege is the final confirmation of the immense power of Soviet industrial mobilization and strategic endurance. Compelling evidence: the continuous production of tanks and artillery by the Kirov Works, combined with the relentless success of the Road of Life, proved that Soviet industrial capacity and human will were sufficient to overcome the Wehrmacht's tactical superiority. The ultimate failure of the German army to take or starve the city confirmed that the vast resources of the Soviet Union could be brought to bear, making the final outcome of the war a certainty dictated by overwhelming production and supply. Insightful expert quote, "The battle provided a profound demonstration that systemic resilience, the ability to maintain command, industry, and a logistical lifeline under extreme duress, is the ultimate requirement for winning a war of attrition." Vivid example: the image of the half-frozen barges and the determined truck drivers fighting the ice remains the most potent symbol of the human effort required to defeat Hitler's calculated brutality, affirming the ultimate triumph of human will over military force. The rich explanation for the battle's timeless legacy is that it confirmed that the resilience of a population and its industry are the ultimate strategic resources. Leningrad was a victory of human will over calculated brutality, ensuring the city's story serves as a permanent, powerful warning for generations to come. Endurance over force. The ultimate measure of a siege's success is the defender's will to survive and maintain strategic function. The resilience of Leningrad proved that ideology cannot annihilate human will,